Welcome to the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group's 2023 to 2024 programme, It's Complicated. This year's sessions seek to reclaim the phrase, it's complicated, as a tool for unravelling nuanced colonial issues surrounding heritage throughout time. Today's speaker is Alexandra Rose. Alex is an experienced social worker and international peace fellow at the University of North Carolina. She specializes in working with heritage institutions where she uses micro and macro approaches that support clients to see the dynamic connection between past and present through relational and systems mapping approaches. Alex's topic today will be The More You See, the More You Know, turning towards complexity through systems mapping. Welcome, Alex. The floor is yours.
G'day, everyone. That's such a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's really nice and exciting to be with you all virtually. Good morning to those joining from North Carolina, and afternoon if you're coming to us from the UK, and a big hello to all time spectrums and places in between. It's really meaningful to me that the topic of this series is It's Complicated, because as Freire just mentioned, the title of my talk is about complexity. It's called The More You See, the More You Know. And what I want to step you through today is a type of thinking that helps us to engage with complexity for all that it is. And if there is anyone that knows, it's the people on this call, that the work of decolonisation in museums and in the heritage sector is complex work. And there are lots of long-standing and very well-established reasons why it's so complex. Many of us could easily identify some of them. And so you'll be familiar with some of what I'm talking about today and familiar with many of those reasons. But awareness of those reasons alone doesn't always help us to engage with that complexity. And in fact, sometimes that awareness of complexity can bring with it a sense of overwhelm. So what I want to present to you today is a tool called systems mapping. And it's a tool that not only helps us engage with complexity, but turn towards that complexity, be present with that complexity, and use that complexity in service of developing intentional and more sustainable interventions. I'll be joined by my colleague Megan Backhouse, who is the lead curator of the World Cultures Gallery at National Museums Liverpool, for the Q&A, and we really look forward to taking your questions. But for now, I'm going to share my screen and let's get started. All right, I think, can everyone see that? Have I got you with me? Can you guys see the screen? Someone let me know.
Yes, we can.
Amazing. So before I jump into the presentation, I want to acknowledge the beautiful land that I'm dialing into you from today. And this is the land of the Ino, Tutelo, Saponi, Okanichi and Shakori Native people. Where I'm standing at the moment is in Orange County, North Carolina, and this is home to the Siouan-speaking tribes and the Okanichi band of the Saponi Nation. The land that I'm on today is changing seasons. There are leaves falling all around us, and there's a message of change in the air, and I want to acknowledge the connection that these tribes have with the land that we're on and sharing with them today. So the outline of this talk, I'm going to chat a little bit about the context of the research, tell you some information about systems thinking, step you through the mapping process, share the map and its findings, discuss some strengths and limitations, and then there'll be a Q&A at the end. And I want to frame this by saying, because I'm presenting to the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group, I'm starting from the position that most of the people on this call know what decolonisation is. So this talk is more about systems mapping as a tool for supporting and boosting decolonisation work, rather than a discussion of definitions or what decolonisation is and what it isn't. So I want to give you a little bit of context, and the frame for this is the quote by Margaret Kovach, which is, You know what you know from where you stand. And for most of my life, I've been standing as a non-Aboriginal Australian born on Wiradjuri country, which is in Western New South Wales towards the centre of Australia. But I've got roots on the coast in Bundjalung country and roots in Kaurna land in South Australia. And when we think of the spectrum of what social work is, I tend to locate my approach at one end, which is what we call critical social work. And this is a way of thinking which acknowledges some of social work's complicities in systems of oppression and harm, but it also takes a really liberatory lens on thinking about interrelationships between people, between their environments and their systems. So that's the kind of hat that I'm wearing when I come into this. At the moment, I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow sponsored by Duke and the University of North Carolina, and they've sponsored this research in terms of helping me get to Liverpool over the summer. What I'm going to chat to you about is a 10-week mapping project to explore enablers and inhibitors of museum decolonisation in the current World Cultures Gallery, and I'll give you a bit more context about that too. But it was done between June and August this year, so it's relatively fresh. And the other pin on the map there is in Liverpool, which is where the World Museum is and which is where National Museums Liverpool is located. And the collection to share with you today is the World Cultures Gallery. It's housed within the World Museum, and it's a pretty large anthropological and ethnographic collection with objects from Africa, Asia, the Pacific, the Americas, Oceania, and there are around 40,000 objects in that collection and only 3 staff. So they're doing incredible work, amazing work with very little resources. So one of those staff members, Megan, will be joining us at the end. So what is systems thinking? Well, a defining characteristic of a system is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the parts together produce an effect that is different from what is produced by the parts separately. And systems thinking can and should be used to solve problems, but it's less of a problem-solving approach and more an approach of problem appreciation or problem anticipation. But we know from systems science that when we spend time with the problem, when we spend time looking at the problem, understanding the problem, in some ways immersing ourselves within the problem, this organically leads to solutions anyway, and often those solutions are more effective and more sustainable. Systems thinking helps us get a bird's eye view and zoom out really far from the problem before we zoom back in a little bit closer. And it can also be thought of as a method of collective inquiry because you're often getting points of information and perspectives from lots of different places to help you build something. And on this slide, you can see some of the tools that systems thinking helps to give us to turn towards that complexity and engage with that complexity. And it reminds us that categorization into separateness and individual silos and discrete kind of events doesn't allow us to see the complexity and the interrelatedness. And this is something that Indigenous and originating communities have been telling us for a really long time, that there is value and importance and meaning in plurality, in multiple narratives, in intersecting histories over time. So before I turn to the next slide, I'm going to show you on the next slide a screenshot of the systems map that was built as a result of this research. But I invite you just to notice what comes up for you when I show you the map. What are your initial thoughts? I'm not going to ask you to share, but just see what comes up for you when you first see it. So here is a systems map for the World Cultures Gallery at National Museums Liverpool. And I might be projecting a little bit or making some assumptions here, but perhaps some of the things that come up are a sense of overwhelm, or like, what am I looking at here? Where do I start? Or I'm confused, or I'm a bit lost, or like worried. Those are really, really valid responses to have to this, and it's super relevant because the way that we feel when we first look at this systems map is reflective of the dynamics of the system. So every system is perfectly designed to produce the results that it's producing. And in this case, this complex, maybe bowl of spaghetti is intersecting and overlapping. There are lines going everywhere, there are arrows. So when we first look at it, it's like, oh, wow, this is a bit complicated or a bit all over the place. Well, the system was designed to be that way. However, at this point, rather than saying who's to blame, because we have a lot of knowledge about who might be to blame for these particular systems and structures built over centuries of years, instead, systems thinking invites us to ask the question, like, what's the system? So rather than who's to blame, what's the system here? And in this way, systems thinking helps redirect our attention away from binary thinking, like right or wrong, or victim or perpetrator, or even past and present, and instead to illuminate the importance of understanding the interconnections between the system. So where many of us are trained and educated to think in terms of polarities, here what we're doing is looking at the grey, and we're immersing ourselves in the nuance and in the complexity of this particular system. So why use this kind of map for a museum? Well, no surprises. Decolonisation work in museums is a complex problem. Many of you will know this more intimately than I do. So it's not like having a flat tyre in a car where there's a very easy, straightforward solution to fix a problem. But instead, the museum objects and the people working with them, the originating communities, the institutions and the laws and the policies all form part of a complex and interconnected web. And this particular web shapes the overall dynamics of the system. So when we're working with wicked problems, we need to be quite intentional about our interventions and the approaches that we take to start to fix them. Now, I really like this particular graphic because it tells us a little bit about what we're working with. If you are not a museum or heritage professional and you go into a museum, or even if you are, what we might see is the leaves on the tree or the branches or even the trunk. And this can look like things like problematic wall text or outdated displays, or perhaps even colonial database terminology in search systems. What we don't see is everything that is below the surface. And below the surface is a much more complex reality, which kind of supports and bolsters this particular infrastructure. So when we take a linear approach, like let's just change the policy or let's just quickly put something else in place, we're not doing anything to address the complex reality that's often existing in places where we can't see it or below the surface. So now I want to turn a little bit to the process of building the map, and buckle up and bear with me because I'm going to try and explain about 300 hours of work in about 3 minutes. But I'll make it manageable and kind. And to do that, I'm going to bring us back to some really small micro examples. So the first step of building the systems map was to define the area of focus. And we start with the guiding star. So if resources were not an issue, if time was not an issue, if you could have whatever you wanted in this particular system, what would it look like? And the team from the World Cultures Gallery came up with, very quickly, might I add, a decolonised museum. This was a really obvious answer for them. It's obviously something that they've spent a lot of time thinking about, and it's the guiding star to their work where they ultimately want to end up. The next step was to develop a near star. So the near star is something that is still a stretch, but potentially achievable within the next 5 to 10 years and is a really good step on the way to the guiding star. And the team came up with a redisplayed gallery, which decenters curatorial expertise and recenters Indigenous and originating communities' knowledge, thought, and authority. Great. So we know where we're going. But we don't know why we're still here. And this is where the framing question comes in. So the question that the systems map seeks to answer is what accounts for the fact that despite explicit commitments to do so, decolonising the museum is so hard to do. So people are familiar with this idea of the guiding star and the near star. Perhaps your own institution has ones that sound very similar. And yet we know that we're not there and we're still kind of far away. So the systems map is mapping the system exactly as it exists now, not how we want it to be, not how it used to be, but what is happening in the system right now that tells us a bit about why our near star and our guiding star are still far away. So the second step is to collect data. And I won't read out this list, but these are just some of the places that data for the systems map came from. And from this list of places, I started to generate a list of forces. So imagine all of the things that you could possibly think of that impact how the system works. So here is just an example of 9 forces. And a force, remember, is just something that influences the system. In this particular case, on that list were 315 variables. So that's quite a lot of things that help us understand why the system works the way it does. But I've got 9 here, and some of you will be familiar with some of these and others maybe not so much. We've got things that are very specific to museums, like clunky databases or poor provenance. And then we've also got really multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary ideas, things like cultural humility or empathy. So the next step is to start to think about these variables in terms of whether they help the system or harm the system. And this is a process of really sorting everything out into enablers or inhibitors. Now, it won't surprise you to know that some of these variables are both. And a good example is discomfort. We know that discomfort can get in the way of decolonisation work in museums, but it can also enable decolonisation work in museums. So not everything belongs to only one clear-cut category. Categorise, iterate, make connections. Categorise, iterate, make connections, and again, and again, and again, and again. And as you're doing that, what starts to emerge are some particular themes or headings. So remembering that I've really brought these down to very micro examples, but from the variables, start to get some themes starting to emerge. Those themes will ultimately go on to become regions of the map, but this is still relatively early on. So next is to, just waiting for my thing to catch up. So to conduct some workshops with the team, and here you can see them doing a non-endorsed social work intervention, otherwise called post-it note trauma. Would not recommend this, but my colleagues were very gracious because what they had to do was to sort out all of these variables in terms of their connections to each other. So here is the 315 variables. At this point, you can see that they've been categorised into upstream causes and downstream effects. The themes have already been identified, and now the difficult process of the work is figuring out the relationships that they have to each other. So in this image, we can start to see that many loops have been created, and we've got headings and themes. Each loop has a title. But what I really like about this particular image is that it reminds me of that story of the 6 people that are blindfolded, and they're all standing in front of an elephant. And they're all asked to examine one part of the elephant, but they're blindfolded, right? So they all come to very different conclusions on what the elephant is. One person who's got the tail definitely thinks that they're holding a broom. Someone else is certain that they are up against a wall. The person with the trunk thinks they've got a very large snake. And kind of the moral is that they're all partly right, but entirely wrong when we put together. So this phase of the systems mapping is about taking off the blindfold and seeing the full picture, seeing the parts of the system that are in relationship to each other, how big different parts of the system are, and what happens when you can see the full scope of what you're working in. And at this particular point, clients that we work with for systems mapping often say, whoa, I didn't realize it was so big, or this is much more complex than what I initially thought. So at this point, I'm just going to stop the screen share and change to show you the systems map, where I'm going to talk you through some of the parts of the map. So you've seen this already, so it won't come as too much of a shock, but we know that this particular map answers the question, what accounts for the fact that, despite explicit commitments to do so, decolonising the museum is so hard to do? Well, here is the answer to that question. I should mention that the map is publicly available. You can access it via the link. And the beautiful thing about this software is that it's all interactive. So you can click on particular nodes and it will bring up, perhaps not in this particular presentation mode, but it will bring up a side panel. I'll try and show you that afterwards. So I want to step you through very quickly some regions of the map, and then I'll stop and give 2 examples. So there were 7 particular regions of the map that help us to answer this question. And they're all centered around a deep structure, or what we call a core narrative. So if nothing else, we could just look at the nodes in this particular part of the map and we'd have a pretty good understanding of what's going on here. We've got government policy as one of the regions of the map. There's also white supremacy as a region of the map. A smaller section of the map is perceived British or Western superiority. This is a very large section of the map, and it accounts for museums' history as sites of othering. So the size of the section of the map is relevant to how much influence it has on the system. Now, this is where I want to stop just for a moment. This is the section called Fear and Emotions. And in this particular area of the map, it's actually an inhibitor to decolonisation work. And I'll step you through one of the processes why. Let's start somewhere like perfectionism, right? It's something that is kind of ingrained in settler colonial notions of work. We know it can often lead to a fear of failure. From a fear of failure, it's pretty quick to get to shame, particularly in an environment that has cancel culture. Shame leads us to feelings of overwhelm. Feelings of overwhelm often bring us to a place of burnout. And of course, when we're burnt out, we have low mental resources to be able to be radically reimagining things. So it understandably leads us to acceptance of the way that things are. This is what we would call a negative reinforcing loop. So if we don't do anything, we'll just keep going around and around and around. But there are also consequences of this loop, because from burnout, we know that resources in museums are often diverted to simpler areas, hindering decolonisation work. And this is really severely impacted by the somewhat outdated but still residual belief that museum work is not emotional. If I click on this text panel here, you might see, yeah, here we go. So this is in the ways that the map is interactive. You should be able to click on different nodes and it will bring up our definition of that particular node. So this is what we call a challenge area of the map, or a place of the map where some intervention might be possible. Many people might relate to this particular loop and how it plays out in their own decolonising work. But it's not all bad. There were some really bright spots on the map as well, and I want to show you a bright spot before we finish for questions. This particular area of the map relates to museums' capacity for social healing. And let's just start here around sector acknowledgement or past wrongdoings. it often leads to a desire to challenge neutrality and a genuine interest for museums to be part of restorative processes. When that happens, we tend to get this cascade of positive flow-on effects. Repatriation and restitution might be one of them. This might be one of them. Or altogether, they might be a particular outcome, but each individual node also helps generate a sense of healing. Now, this healing might be, for example, healing of individual staff members, or healing of originating communities, or healing of people that have been doing this work for a long time from different places. Ultimately, where we kind of want to be mindful of, though, is that institutional healing is also really possible. And part of decolonisation work involves doing our own healing around our identities and the legacies that we carry with us into this particular work. So although the aim of decolonisation work is not institutional healing, it's something that we should pay attention to and be mindful of and seek to generate as part of the overall decolonisation process, because there's a lot of healing that needs to happen here, and it's not just institutions that give that to originating communities. So I'm going to come back to the slides now. Are you guys back with me on the screen of the slides? Can you see that?
No, not yet.
Let me stop sharing and I will reshare the slide screen. I've just got one more slide to share. How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So some strengths of this particular approach, and I'll just read out some quotes from staff. The systems map helped me put everything into perspective. No wonder it's been hard. It's a system that's over 300 years in the making. Or, we've been having these conversations for years, but I've never seen it all captured in the one place. It's validating. Or anytime I start to wonder why we haven't achieved more, the systems map helps me appreciate all that we're up against. It's helped us identify places where we could start to have a bigger impact on the system. And this is one of the really meaningful things about systems mapping, is that it often allows people to take off their shoulders the individual sense of responsibility for systems that have been built over centuries and have been built by particular people in particular ways. So it's not the responsibility of individual staff to decolonise entire institutions, to decolonise international law, to decolonise collections that have been built over 500 years. Sometimes taking that individual responsibility off their shoulders frees up just enough room for really creative and connective interventions on a small scale. And of course, we know that what we do on a small scale sets the pattern for the whole system. Like any research, there are limitations of this particular map. And an important one is that the map is not the terrain. So before Google Maps, I used to carry around what we call in Australia a Rolodex or a map book. And anytime that a new road was built or there was a detour, the map is no longer valid. So it's not the same as doing the things. This is not the terrain. And of course, maps are static, whereas infrastructure is dynamic and changing all the time. It's also important to note that there are limited community voices in this map. We do have audience feedback from NML as a part of the data that went into the map, but there were no interviews with community members. So this is a place where the research could be strengthened. And it's a constant work in progress. There is like so much that can keep going into this map. And it's something that we'll continue to build over time and update as we go. So the next steps really are to identify key levers in the system. And by that, I just mean, where are the best places to intervene? And one way of doing that is seeing what is the most connected. Where are the nodes in this system that have the most arrows coming to and from them? Because once we change that, we're likely to have broader flow and impacts for the system. So a question perhaps for people in the audience is, how would your institution's map look? Would it be similar? Would it be different? I would imagine that many things would be very the same and some things might be different. And I want to know, is your museum collection the next map? I'm interested in building more maps, so feel free to reach out if you're interested in this kind of work, if you feel that it could have value to your efforts to decolonise. I'm really open to receiving questions or feedback or thoughts. If you're interested in systems thinking and systems mapping as a way of doing it, feel free to reach out. There is my email. So I'm going to stop sharing now and I'm back with you for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Alex.